the 27 hours Muhammad Ali spent in a Houston jail cell after refusing to be inducted into the United States Army. He wasn't thinking about boxing or championships or being the greatest. He was thinking about whether he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, whether standing on principle was worth losing everything, whether dying in prison for refusing to kill people in Vietnam was noble or just stupid. Outside, newspapers ran headlines calling him a traitor, suggesting he could face execution, celebrating his downfall. Inside, alone in the dark, Ali sat on a concrete bench and asked himself the question that haunts anyone who sacrifices for their beliefs. What if I'm wrong? And what happens when being right still costs you everything? April 28, 1967, started like any day that changes history. Ordinary until it wasn't. Muhammad Ali woke up in his Houston hotel room knowing what was coming. He'd been called to report to the Armed Forces examining an entrance station for induction into the United States Army. The Vietnam War was consuming young American men by the thousands, and the government had decided that Muhammad Ali, despite his fame, despite his claims of religious exemption, despite the global attention his refusal had generated, would be drafted like anyone else. Either he'd step forward when his name was called and become a soldier, or he'd refuse and face the consequences. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no way to be both Muhammad Ali the conscientious objector and Muhammad Ali the heavyweight champion. The country, the government, the boxing establishment, they'd all made that clear, so Ali had to choose. And by the time he walked into that induction center that morning, surrounded by other young men who'd been called to serve, he'd already made his choice. He just hadn't lived the consequences yet. That would come later. In a jail cell. For 27 hours that would feel like 27 years. How do you prepare for the moment when your principles cost you your freedom? How do you steel yourself against fear when you know the decision you're about to make will change everything? Your career, your reputation, your life. Ali had tried, had prayed, had talked to his advisors in the Nation of Islam who'd told him this was the right path, that Allah would protect him, that sacrificing for faith was the highest calling. But standing in that induction center, watching other young men, most of them poor, most of them black or brown, most of them with no choice because they didn't have Ali's fame or platform, step forward when called, Ali must have felt the weight of what his refusal meant, not just for him, for everyone watching, for every young man who was being told to go die in a jungle for reasons nobody could adequately explain. Was his refusal courage? Or was it just privilege? The ability to say no because he was famous enough that people would pay attention. These were questions Ali would grapple with for the rest of his life. But in that moment, they were theoretical. The reality was simpler. His name was about to be called, and he had to decide whether to answer. The room was institutional, bureaucratic, filled with the kind of cold efficiency that government buildings specialize in. Young men sat in rows, waiting, nervous, some excited, believing the propaganda about serving their country, defending freedom, fighting communism. Others resigned, understanding they had no choice, that resistance meant prison, that their families needed them to survive this and come home. And then there was Ali, sitting among them but separate, because everyone knew who he was, knew he'd been saying for months that he wouldn't go, knew this moment was coming. The officer began calling names. Thomas Anderson. A young man stood, stepped forward. James Brown. Another stood. The process was mechanical, impersonal. Names called, men responding, the machinery of war processing human beings into soldiers. Then Cassius Marcellus Clay. Ali didn't move, didn't stand, didn't acknowledge the name, because to him, Cassius Clay was dead. Had died when he'd converted to Islam, when he'd been given the name Muhammad Ali by Elijah Muhammad, when he'd chosen identity over the name a slave owner had given his ancestors. The officer looked up, annoyed. Cassius Clay stepped forward. Still nothing. Ali sat there, hands folded in his lap, eyes forward, refusing to recognize a name he no longer claimed. The officer's voice got harder. Cassius Marcellus Clay, this is your final call. Step forward. And still Ali didn't move. Around him, other men shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered. Everyone understood what was happening. Muhammad Ali was refusing induction, was committing a federal crime, was throwing away everything, his title, his career, his freedom, for a principle that most people in that room didn't understand and many actively opposed. The officer made a note on his clipboard and moved on. The moment was over. Except it wasn't, because that moment, that refusal to stand when called, would ripple outward, creating consequences that would define not just Ali's life, but an entire generation's relationship to war, to government, to the question of what you owe a country that hasn't fully granted you citizenship. After the roll call, Ali was pulled aside, given a form, told to write a statement explaining his refusal. And Ali, in his own handwriting, wrote words that would be used against him in court. I refuse to be inducted into the Armed Forces of the United States because I claim to be exempt as a minister of the religion of Islam. Simple. Direct. Unambiguous. The officer read it and gave Ali one final chance. Mr. Clay, do you understand that refusing induction is a federal offense punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine? Ali, and you still refuse? I refuse. That was it. Within hours, Ali was indicted by a grand jury. Within hours, the New York State Athletic Commission had suspended his boxing license. Within hours, the World Boxing Association had stripped him of his championship. Muhammad Ali, heavyweight champion of the world, had lost his title without a single punch being thrown. Lost it to paperwork, to principle, to the machinery of a government that couldn't tolerate a black Muslim refusing to fight its war. And the night was just beginning. Because what happened next? The arrest, the bail, the bizarre clerical error that would send Ali back to a jail cell for 27 hours. That would be when principle met reality in the most visceral, terrifying way. When Ali would sit alone in the dark and wonder if he'd just destroyed his life for nothing. If courage was just another word for stupidity. If standing up was worth falling down. The answer wouldn't come easily, wouldn't come quickly. Would come slowly, painfully, over 27 hours of forced reflection in a place where champions aren't supposed to end up. Where does conviction come from? And how do you maintain it when everything, your freedom, your career, your future, is taken away because of it? Ali was about to find out. The arrest happened fast. FBI agents were waiting outside the induction center, and the moment Ali's refusal became official, they moved in. Handcuffs, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. The image of Muhammad Ali in handcuffs would be on the front page of every major newspaper by evening. Some papers celebrating, others mourning, all of them documenting the fall of a champion who'd chosen principle over pragmatism. He was taken to the Houston Police Department, processed, fingerprinted, photographed. The machinery of the criminal justice system treating him like any other accused felon. Then came the bail hearing, 5,000, which Ali posted immediately. By early evening, he was free, technically, free to return to his hotel, free to face the media circus that had gathered, free to contemplate the reality that he'd just been charged with a felony that could send him to prison for 5 years, that his boxing career was effectively over, that everything he'd built was collapsing around him. But he was free, until he wasn't. Around 11 p.m., there was a knock on his hotel room door. Ali opened it to find police officers. Mr. Clay, there's been an issue with your paperwork. We need you to come back to the station. Ali, confused and exhausted. What issue? I posted bail. I'm free to go. The officer, uncomfortable because even he recognized this was unusual. There's been a clerical error, a technical problem with the bail processing. You need to return to custody until it's resolved, which made no legal sense. Bail had been posted. Ali had been released. There was no legitimate reason to rearrest him. But this was Houston, Texas in 1967, and Muhammad Ali had just refused to fight in Vietnam. And sometimes, the law bends when power wants it to. So Ali, who'd spent the day being processed through the criminal justice system, who'd lost his championship, who'd been indicted on federal charges, who'd faced the consequences of his choice, now faced one more being taken back to a jail cell. For the night. Possibly longer. With no clear explanation of when he'd be released. He could have fought it. Could have called lawyers. Could have made a scene. But Ali was tired, was emotionally drained, was beginning to understand that this was just how it would be now. Arbitrary exercises of power meant to remind him that he'd made himself an enemy of the state, and enemies of the state don't get normal treatment. So he went. Let them handcuff him again. Let them put him in the back of a police car. Let them take him to a jail cell, lock the door, and leave him there, alone, in the dark, with nothing but his thoughts and his fears and the question that was starting to grow from a whisper into a scream. Did I just destroy my life for a principle that nobody will remember and fewer will thank me for? This is where the 27 hours began. Not in glory, not in certainty, but in darkness, in isolation, in the cold, hard reality of a concrete bench in a Houston jail cell where champions don't belong, but this one was anyway, because he'd chosen conscience over convenience. And now he'd have 27 hours to wonder if that choice had been worth it. The cell was small, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, concrete walls, concrete floor, concrete bench that served as a bed, a toilet in the corner, a single bulb behind thick wire mesh that cast more shadows than light. No windows, no clock, no way to mark time except by feeling it stretch and compress, minutes becoming hours, becoming an eternity of sitting alone with the consequences of your decisions. Ali had been in tight spaces before, locker rooms before fights, training camps where the world shrunk to just him and the work. But those spaces had purpose, had forward momentum, had an endpoint where doors opened and he'd walk out to cheers and cameras and the validation that comes with being excellent at something difficult. This space had none of that. This was just waiting, waiting for bureaucracy to sort itself out, waiting to learn if this was the beginning of 5 years of waiting in spaces like this, waiting to see if the courage he'd shown that morning would sustain him through the reality of what courage costs. He paced first, back and forth in the tiny space, 3 steps one direction, turn 3 steps back, burning energy, trying to outdistance the thoughts that were catching up to him. The first few hours he was angry at the system, at the hypocrisy of being told to fight for freedom in Vietnam while being denied freedom at home, at the injustice of losing his title without losing a fight, at everyone who'd been so quick to condemn him, to call him a coward, to suggest that refusing to kill people he'd never met somehow made him less of a man. The anger felt good, felt righteous, felt like fuel that could sustain him through whatever came next. But anger is exhausting, and as midnight became 1 a.m., became 2 a.m., the anger started fading, replaced by something harder to fight: doubt. He sat on the concrete bench, back against the cold wall, and let the doubt in. What if this was a mistake? What if he'd thrown away everything for a principle that wouldn't matter in the long run? What if 5 years from now, or 10, or 20, he'd look back at this night and think, I could have just gone, could have served somehow, could have found a way to not fight while still being inducted, could have kept my title, my career, my freedom. What did refusing actually accomplish? These thoughts weren't new. He'd had them before. But it's different thinking them in the abstract versus thinking them in a jail cell, realizing that abstract principles have concrete consequences, and you're sitting in one. Ali thought about his mother, Odessa, who'd raised him to be proud but careful, who'd taught him that being black in America meant choosing your battles because you couldn't fight them all without being destroyed. Who'd probably be awake right now, praying for him, worried about him, wondering if she'd raised her son to be too proud for his own good. He thought about Malcolm X, his friend, his mentor, who'd been assassinated 2 years earlier for his own principles, for refusing to be who powerful people wanted him to be, who'd died in front of his wife and children because standing up made you a target. Was that Ali's future? Not dying necessarily, though the death threats had been coming steadily, but being destroyed, made into an example, erased from the thing he was best at because he dared to say no. By 3 a.m., Ali had moved past anger and doubt into something closer to fear. Real fear. Not the performance fear of pre-fight theatrics, but genuine terror about what his life was about to become. Prison was a real possibility. 5 years of his physical prime wasted in a cell. He'd be 32 when he got out, if he got out, and 30, 2 was ancient for a heavyweight. His speed would be gone. His reflexes would be shot. The career he'd built would be over. And for what? So he could say he stood on principle. So he could tell himself he'd been brave. What good was bravery if it destroyed you? These were the thoughts that filled the cell around 3 a.m. Dark thoughts. The kind that come when you're alone and tired and starting to wonder if everyone who called you crazy was right. If refusing to be inducted was noble or just self-destructive. If principles were worth this price, or if the price proved the principles were wrong. Ali put his head in his hands. The strongest, most confident man in boxing, maybe in the world, reduced to this, sitting in a jail cell wondering if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Is this what courage looks like? Or is this just stubbornness taken too far? And when everyone's against you, when everything you've built is being taken away, when sitting in this cell is a direct result of choices you made, how do you know if those choices were right? You don't. Not in the moment. Not when it's dark and you're alone and the consequences are all around you. You just have to decide what you believe and hope that believing is enough. But what if it's not? What if belief is just another word for delusion? What if refusing to kill people in Vietnam is noble, but leads to you being killed? Metaphorically, professionally, maybe literally at home, Ali didn't have answers, just questions. Endless questions. Circling and circling through his mind as the hours stretched on, and the cell stayed cold, and the light stayed dim, and nothing changed except his growing understanding that he was trapped. Not just in this cell, but in the consequences of his choice, and there was no going back. Couldn't call the induction center and say he'd changed his mind. Couldn't unrefuse. Couldn't undo what had been done. Could only sit here and wait and wonder and hope that when morning came, he'd still believe his choice had been right, even if it destroyed him, even if nobody thanked him, even if history forgot. Because some things you do not for recognition, but because you can't live with yourself if you don't. Was this one of those things? Or had Ali confused conscience with ego, principle with stubbornness, courage with stupidity? Sitting there at 3 a.m. in a Houston jail cell, he genuinely didn't know. And that uncertainty was more terrifying than any opponent he'd ever faced. But then something shifted. Not dramatically. Not like a revelation from above. Just gradually, as the hours continued and exhaustion gave way to a strange kind of clarity. Ali started thinking about different things. Not what he'd lost, but what he'd kept. He still had his name, Muhammad Ali, not Cassius Clay. The name he'd chosen, the identity he'd claimed, that hadn't been taken. He still had his faith, his belief in Islam, in Allah, in the teachings that told him killing was wrong, that unjust wars should be resisted, that conscience mattered more than convenience. That hadn't been taken either. And he still had himself, his integrity, the ability to look at his reflection when he got out of this cell and found a mirror, and know he'd done what he believed was right. Win or lose, prison or freedom, praise or condemnation, he'd stood up. He'd refused. He'd said no when the government told him to say yes. And that choice, that fundamental assertion of autonomy, of personhood, of refusing to be property that could be commanded to kill on demand, that was his. Nobody could take it. They could take his title, his license, his freedom. Maybe even his life if things got bad enough. But they couldn't make him a killer. Couldn't force him to violate his conscience. Couldn't take away the choice he'd made. And sitting there in that cell around 4 a.m., as the darkest part of night started giving way to the first hints of dawn, Ali realized something. He'd been thinking about this wrong. He'd been measuring his choice against what it cost him, his career, his freedom, his money, his reputation, all external things, things that could be taken. But the real measure wasn't what he'd lost. It was what he'd kept, and what he'd kept was himself. Whole, uncompromised, able to face whatever came next knowing he hadn't betrayed who he was. That clarity didn't make the fear go away. Didn't make the cell less cold or the bench less hard or the uncertainty less real. But it provided something more valuable purpose. He wasn't sitting in this cell because he'd made a mistake. He was sitting here because he'd made a choice. A hard choice. A choice that cost everything external to preserve something internal. And that trade, everything he had for the ability to live with himself, that was the right trade. Even if it didn't feel like it at 3 a.m., even if the world called him a coward for refusing to fight, even if prison waited, it was the right trade. Because what's the alternative? Fight in a war you don't believe in. Kill people you have no quarrel with. Return home with blood on your hands and a title around your waist, and the knowledge that you sold your soul for validation from people who'd never understand what you gave up. No, that wasn't a trade Ali could make. So he'd made the other one, had chosen prison over complicity, isolation over compromise, principle over pragmatism. And sitting there in that cell, with hours still to go before release, Ali made peace with that choice. Not because it felt good. Not because he was certain it would work out, but because it was his, and in a life where so much had been decided for him. Where he'd been born, what color his skin was, what opportunities were available, how he was supposed to behave, this choice was his. Completely, irrevocably. His. And that was worth 27 hours in a cell. Was worth 5 years in prison if it came to that. Was worth everything he'd lost and everything he might still lose. Because at the end, when they tallied up his life, Ali wanted to be able to say, I was myself, fully, without compromise, without apology. I was Muhammad Ali, not Cassius Clay, not who you wanted me to be, not a soldier for wars I didn't believe in. Just me. And if that's worth nothing else, it's worth everything to me. This is what 27 hours alone gave Ali, not doubt, though there was plenty of that. Not fear, though that was there too, but clarity. About what mattered, about what was worth fighting for, about the difference between courage, which is acting despite fear, and recklessness, which is acting without thought. And Ali's choice, whatever else it was, had been thoughtful, deliberate. Based on beliefs he'd examined, faith he'd embraced, principles he'd tested against the fire of public opinion, and found still standing. So when the guards came at 8 a.m. on April 30th and told him the paperwork had been processed and he was free to go, Ali stood up from that concrete bench different than when he'd sat down. Not broken by doubt, not crushed by fear, but clarified, certain, ready for whatever came next. Because he'd spent 27 hours asking himself the hardest question a person can ask, was it worth it? And his answer, tested in isolation and darkness and the cold reality of consequences, was yes, it was worth it. It would always be worth it. And nobody, not the government, not the boxing commissions, not the critics who called him a coward, could take that certainty away. Because it was his, earned in a jail cell, paid for with everything he'd lost, and worth every second of those 27 hours. That was the victory, not in that cell. Not in that moment. But in the years that followed, when Ali's choice was vindicated, when the war he'd refused to fight became widely acknowledged as unjust, when young people who'd been against him came to see him as a hero, when history looked back at April 28, 1967, and saw not a coward but a man of principle. But Ali didn't know any of that sitting in the cell. Didn't know he'd be proven right. Didn't know he'd get his license back, his freedom back, his career back. Didn't know he'd become more famous for his refusal than for his boxing. All he knew was what he believed. And sometimes, when the world is against you, and the future is uncertain, and you're sitting alone in a jail cell wondering if you've destroyed your life, belief is all you have. And sometimes it's enough. The walk out of that jail was strange, anticlimactic. After 27 hours of intense self-examination, of confronting fear and doubt and uncertainty, Ali just walked out, through a door, down a hallway, into sunlight that felt too bright after all that time in artificial light. There were reporters waiting, of course, always reporters, shouting questions as he emerged. Are you sorry? Will you change your mind? What about the boys dying in Vietnam? And Ali, tired but clear-eyed, gave them the same answer he'd been giving. I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. I'm not going 10,000 miles to help murder, kill, and burn people simply to help continue the domination of white slave masters over dark people. This is the day and age when such evil injustice must come to an end. The words were the same, but something about how he said them was different, more certain, less performative. like a man who'd tested his beliefs against the worst consequences and found them still standing. The reporters wrote their stories. Most continued to condemn him, called him a draft dodger, a coward, un-American. But some, a few at first, then more as years passed, started asking different questions about the war itself, about whether it was just, about whether refusing to fight might take more courage than going. Ali's refusal became part of a larger movement. Young people, particularly on college campuses, who'd been questioning the war found in Ali's stand a powerful example. Here was someone with everything to lose who'd said no anyway, who'd chosen principle over power, who'd proven that resistance was possible even when it cost everything. The government tried to make an example of him. His trial came quickly. The verdict was predetermined. Guilty, maximum sentence 5 years in prison and 10 zaulos in fine. But then something unexpected happened. The case went to appeals and kept going, through circuit courts, through years of legal battles, through a changing American landscape where opposition to the war grew from fringe to mainstream. And finally, in 1971, 4 years after those 27 hours in a Houston jail cell, the Supreme Court overturned his conviction. Not because they thought he was right. The decision was technical, based on procedural errors. But the result was the same. Muhammad Ali was free, fully, legally free, and his boxing license was restored. He could fight again, and he did. First against Jerry Quarry, then Joe Frazier, then, in the fight that would define his comeback, George Foreman in Zaire, the Rumble in the Jungle, where Ali, at 32, having lost his prime years to exile, somehow found a way to win, to reclaim the championship that had been stripped from him, to prove that principle and victory weren't mutually exclusive. But the real victory, the one that mattered more than any belt, had happened in that jail cell, when Ali chose who he was going to be and accepted the cost. That was the fight that mattered. That was the championship that lasted. When Ali died in 2016, the world mourned. Presidents spoke at his funeral. World leaders praised him. The same government that had prosecuted him, the same establishment that had stripped his title, now claimed him as an American hero. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. But by then, Ali had long since made peace with the contradiction, had understood that history is written by those who outlive their critics, and he'd outlived his. Not by being vindicated in that jail cell, not by knowing in those 27 hours that everything would work out, but by holding on to belief when belief was all he had. By choosing himself over approval, by sitting in darkness and finding light not outside the cell but inside himself. That's what those 27 hours were about. Not punishment, not consequence, but choice. The choice to be Muhammad Ali, completely and without apology, regardless of cost. And the discovery that some costs, however high, are worth paying. Because the alternative, being Cassius Clay, soldier, killer, champion on someone else's terms, that cost would have been higher, would have required giving up something no championship could replace himself. So he sat in that cell for 27 hours and chose himself, chose conscience, chose to be remembered not just as the greatest fighter, but as a man who stood for something when standing cost everything. Was it worth it? Ask him in that cell at 3 a.m., and the answer was uncertain. Ask him in 1970, watching his prime years slip away in legal battles and exile, and the answer was complicated. Ask him in 1974, standing over George Foreman in Zaire, having reclaimed everything that was taken from him, and the answer was yes. Ask history, looking back at April 28, 1967, and seeing not a draft dodger but a civil rights icon, and the answer is obvious. But the only answer that mattered was Ali's, and he gave it in that cell, over 27 hours, through fear and doubt and uncertainty. Through darkness that had nothing to do with the lights being off and everything to do with not knowing if his choice was right. He gave his answer by enduring, by surviving, by walking out of that cell still believing what he'd believed when he walked in. That conviction, tested by isolation, proven in darkness, forged in 27 hours of being alone with consequences, that was Muhammad Ali's greatest fight. And he won it, not by knockout, not by decision, but by refusing to quit on himself, by sitting in that cell and choosing to be free even when freedom meant imprisonment. by understanding that real freedom isn't about where your body is. It's about whether your soul belongs to you or to people who want to use it for their purposes. Ali's soul was his, completely, kept in that cell, held onto through 27 hours that felt like forever, and carried out into a world that would eventually understand what he'd known all along, that some battles aren't fought in rings. Some victories aren't measured in titles, and some champions prove their greatness not by what they win, but by what they refuse to lose. Muhammad Ali refused to lose himself. For 27 hours in a Houston jail cell, for 3 years of exile, for the rest of his life, and that refusal, that stubborn, costly, beautiful refusal to be anything other than who he was, that was his legacy. Built in darkness, tested in isolation, proven over 27 hours when nobody was watching and everything was at stake. This is what courage looks like. Not in the spotlight. Not in the ring. Not when cameras are rolling and crowds are cheering, but alone, in a cell, at 3 a.m. When you're asking yourself if you made the right choice and the only thing you can hold on to is belief, and you hold on anyway. That's courage. That's conviction. That's Muhammad Ali. For 27 hours, and forever after. The man who sat in darkness and chose light. Who lost everything except what mattered. Who proved that freedom is a choice you make inside, regardless of the walls around you. That's the story of 27 hours in a Houston jail. Not a tragedy. Not even really about jail. About choice. About consequence. About a young man sitting alone and deciding who he was going to be when being that person cost him everything. He chose himself, and the world is better for it, even if it took decades to understand, even if Ali never saw full vindication, even if, sitting in that cell, he didn't know how the story ended. He chose. And the choice was right, and 27 hours in darkness proved it. Because when you walk out of that darkness still believing, still standing, still yourself, that's victory. That's what it means to be the greatest. Not in a ring, in a cell, where the only opponent is doubt and the only weapon is faith. Ali fought that fight for 27 hours and won, forever.